The envelope had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 11 days. I know the exact number because I started counting the morning after I found it wedged between my door and the frame, left there without a knock or a call. 11 days. And every morning I made my coffee and looked at it. And every morning I told myself, not yet. I wasn't ready for what it might say. Or maybe I was afraid of what I might do once I read it. I was still standing there, staring at it the morning my mother called to remind me, for the third time that week, that Brandon's show was at 8, and that I needed to be there by 7:30 to help set up. I want to tell you about the kind of daughter I was before I tell you about the kind of daughter I became. I was the kind who drove 2 hours each way to help my parents move furniture when my father threw out his back. The kind who skipped a work conference in Denver because my mother said the house felt empty on Thanksgiving and she needed help cooking. The kind who sat in parking lots after family dinners, crying quietly where no one could see, and then walked back in with a smile because I didn't want to make anything harder. I was 28 years old. I had spent 5.5 years working toward my PhD in biomedical engineering at a university 2 states away from where I grew up. My dissertation was titled something long and complicated that I won't bore you with, but the short version is that I spent those years developing a tissue model that could help researchers test drug responses without using animal subjects. My advisor called it some of the most promising graduate work she had supervised in 15 years. I had a defense date. I had a job offer letter sitting in my email inbox from a research institute in Edinburgh, Scotland. And I had a brother named Brandon who played guitar. Brandon was 24. He was charming and loud and funny in the way that fills a room, the way that makes parents exchange proud glances across the dinner table. He had dropped out of college after 1 semester, which my parents called following his passion. He had moved back home at 21, which they called smart financial planning. He had gone through 3 bands, 2 managers, and more amplifiers than I could count, all funded in varying degrees by my parents, which they called investing in his future. I never said anything about that. I want to be clear about that. I had my scholarships and my stipend and my ramen and my loans. And I was proud of the path I had chosen. And I didn't begrudge Brandon a single amplifier. What I want you to understand is simply what the landscape looked like. So that when I tell you what happened, you understand that it didn't come from nowhere. My dissertation defense was scheduled for a Saturday in late April. Universities schedule defenses on Saturdays sometimes, especially in engineering departments where committee members have packed weekday calendars and conference travel every other week. It's not unusual. It's also not ideal, but you don't argue with your committee. I had told my parents about the date 4 months in advance. I remember sitting at their kitchen table at Christmas, my mother passing a basket of rolls and my father watching football in the next room, and I said, "Mark your calendars, April 26th, I defend my dissertation, and if everything goes well, I'll be Dr. Claire Matthews by that evening." My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey." My father came to the doorway and said, "We're proud of you, kiddo." And I believed them. I actually believed them. I drove back to my apartment that Christmas night thinking about what it would feel like to cross that finish line with my family watching. I had this picture in my head, soft and warm like something out of a movie I would have watched as a kid, of my parents sitting in those chairs they set out in the hallway outside the defense room, waiting for me to come out with the news. I had imagined my father's handshake turning into a hug. I had imagined my mother crying, the good kind of crying, the proud kind. I held on to that picture for 4 months. I should tell you about Aunt Helen before I go any further, because she matters to this story more than almost anyone else. Aunt Helen is my mother's older sister. She spent 32 years as a nurse, mostly in pediatric oncology, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person she is. She never married, never had children of her own, and I think that's part of why she always showed up so completely for the ones who needed her. She had bad hips, used a cane on hard days, and drove a 12-year-old sedan she refused to replace because, as she put it, "It still gets me where I'm going." Aunt Helen lived 40 minutes from my university. She was the reason I had chosen that school, if I'm honest. Not consciously, maybe, but somewhere in the back of my mind when I was deciding between programs, knowing she was close had made the distance from home feel less like a sentence. She called me every Sunday. Not a text, an actual call. She asked real questions and waited for real answers, which is a skill that turns out to be rarer than you'd think. When I told her about the defense date, she said, "I'll be there," and I didn't even have to ask. So the 4 months passed. I barely slept the last 3 weeks before the defense, running simulations and rehearsing my presentation and second-guessing every graph and citation. My advisor kept telling me I was ready. My lab mates kept telling me I was going to be fine. I nodded and said thank you, and went home and ran through the slides again at midnight. 2 weeks before the date, Brandon called my mother to tell her he had booked a real venue. Not a bar with a small stage in the back, not a community event with a borrowed PA system, but an actual music venue that held about 200 people. He had gotten the booking because a friend of a friend had canceled a last-minute show, and the venue had given him the slot on short notice. It was a genuine step forward for him. I want to acknowledge that. It was good news, and he was excited, and he deserved to be. The show was on April 26th. I found out the same night my mother called to tell me about it. She was so happy, her voice bright and rushing over itself, telling me about the venue and the capacity and how this could be Brandon's real break. I listened. I let her finish. And then I said, "Mom, that's the same day as my defense." There was a pause. She said, "Oh, just that, just oh." And then, after a moment, she said, "Well, the show is at 8. Your defense is in the afternoon, right? Maybe we can do both." I said, "Yes, the defense is at 2. But afterward there's usually a dinner. The committee takes the candidate out. It's a tradition, and I was hoping we could." She said, "Let me talk to your father." I held the phone and listened to the sound of my own kitchen and waited. She came back and said, "Your father thinks this might actually work out fine. We'll come to as much of the defense as we can, and then we need to head back for Brandon's show. He really needs us there, Claire. This is a big deal for him." I said, "I know. My defense is also a big deal for me." She said, "Of course it is. We know that. We're so proud of you. But Brandon has been working toward this for a long time." "I have been working toward this for 5.5 years, I said, and my voice came out very level. Which surprised me. 5.5 years, Mom. She said she would call me later and we would figure it out. She didn't call. I called Aunt Helen that Sunday. She already knew about the conflict, somehow, through the family grapevine or a conversation I wasn't privy to. She didn't pretend otherwise. She said, "I heard, and I'm going to say something you might not want to hear. But I need you to hear it anyway." I said, "Okay." She said, "This is not the first time. It is only the most visible time." I didn't say anything. Because she was right. And I had known she was right for a long time, and saying it out loud was the kind of thing I had been carefully not doing. She said, "I'll be at your defense. I will be in that hallway." I said, "I know. Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Just sleep this week." I tried. The envelope was still on my counter. I had received it the week before the defense from the Research Institute in Edinburgh. It was a formal offer letter, the kind that still comes on paper with letterhead, and I had been holding it at arm's length for 11 days because opening it meant making a decision, and making a decision meant everything was about to change. I was afraid of change the way you're afraid of something you also desperately want. 2 days before the defense, my mother called again. She said, "We talked about it as a family, and we think the best plan is for us to come to the beginning of your presentation and then head out around 3:30 so we can make it back in time to help Brandon set up." I held the phone very still. She said, "You understand, right? He needs help with the equipment, and the venue requires them to load in by 5. I said, "You're going to leave in the middle of my defense." She said, "Not the middle. After your presentation part. The question part is mostly for the committee anyway." I said, "Mom, the defense is the whole thing. You can't just come to the first half and leave." She said, "Claire, your brother needs us." I said, "I need you too." She said, "You've always been the strong one. You don't need us the way Brandon does." I want you to sit with that for a moment. I want you to feel the weight of that sentence, because I have been carrying it for a very long time. You've always been the strong one. As if strength means you don't require anything, as if being capable means being optional, as if I had somehow made myself too competent to deserve showing up for. I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll see you Saturday." And I hung up and I stood in my kitchen and I looked at the envelope. I opened it. The offer was for a 2-year postdoctoral research fellowship at the Edinburgh Institute for Regenerative Medicine. The stipend was generous. The lab was one of the best in the world for my area of research. The start date was flexible, any time within 90 days of acceptance. I read it twice. I put it back on the counter. I went to bed. The morning of the defense, I was awake before 5. I showered and made coffee and stood at my window watching the sun come up over the parking lot of my apartment complex, which is not a beautiful view, but it was mine, and I had looked at it for 5.5 years, and there was something about that morning that made everything feel very final, in a way I couldn't quite name. Aunt Helen texted me at 7. It said, "I'm already in the car. My hip is being dramatic, but I told it to behave. See you at 1:30. I smiled for the first time in several days. My parents texted at 9:30. My mother wrote, "Good luck today, sweetheart. So proud. We'll be there." My father wrote, "Knock 'em dead, kiddo." They had both used exclamation points. I noticed that. The way exclamation points can sometimes be the loudest way of saying nothing at all. I arrived at the university at noon. My committee members trickled in over the next hour, setting up in the conference room, arranging papers. My advisor pulled me into the hallway and said, "You are ready. You have been ready for months. Just tell them what you know." I nodded. My throat was tight. My parents arrived at 1:45, just before the defense began. My mother was dressed nicely. My father had on his good jacket. Brandon was not with them, which I had not expected him to be, but still noticed. They hugged me in the hallway, and my mother cupped my face and said, "We're so proud of you." And she meant it. I know she meant it. That's the thing about my parents that makes it so complicated. They meant it every time. They just meant other things more. Aunt Helen was already seated in the hallway outside the conference room door. She had brought a thermos of coffee and a book, and she stood up when she saw me, and held my face the same way my mother had, and she said, "Go show them what 5.5 years looks like." I went in. I presented for 40 minutes. Methodology, results, implications, future directions. I knew my material so deeply that at some point I stopped seeing the slides and just talked, the way you talk about something you have lived inside of for years. My committee asked questions, hard ones, the kind designed to find the edges of your knowledge, to see where your certainty becomes uncertainty. I found the edges and I named them honestly, and I defended the work I knew, and acknowledged what I didn't, which is what good research actually looks like. At 3:15, my committee asked me to step out while they deliberated. I went into the hallway. My parents were gone. Aunt Helen was still there. She stood up immediately and said nothing, just handed me the extra cup from her thermos and put her hand on my arm. My mother had sent a text at 3:05. It said, "Had to head out, honey. So sorry to miss the end part. We love you so much. Can't wait to hear how it went. Brandon's so nervous. We needed to get back. Call us tonight." I read it once. I put my phone in my pocket. Aunt Helen said, "I'm here." I said, "I know." We stood there in the quiet hallway, and I drank bad thermos coffee, and we waited. 22 minutes later, my advisor opened the door. She was smiling the way people smile when they already know an outcome and have been looking forward to telling you. Not my first name. Dr. Matthews. I think I laughed. Or cried. Probably both. Standing in that hallway under the fluorescent lights, and Aunt Helen made a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. Something between a sob and a cheer, and she pulled me into a hug that accounted for her bad hip and still managed to feel like being held together. My committee came out and shook my hand and said generous and genuine things. My advisor took photographs on her phone. Aunt Helen photobombed 2 of them intentionally and apologized to no one. We went to dinner, the 4 committee members and my advisor and Aunt Helen, to an Italian place near campus. We ordered wine and pasta and talked for 3 hours. Aunt Helen asked my committee members questions about their own research with the genuine curiosity of someone who finds everything interesting, and they loved her immediately, the way everyone loves her. At 9:15, my phone buzzed with a notification. Brandon had posted on social media from the venue a photo of the crowd, which looked like maybe 80 people, his parents somewhere in the front. He had written, "Best night of my life. Grateful for everyone who showed up." I looked at it. I put my phone back down. I drank my wine. My mother called at 10:30. When I was back in my apartment, she was effusive and warm and asked every right question about the defense, and I answered each one, and she said over and over how proud she was, how brilliant I was, how she had always known I would get here. I said, "Thank you, Mom." She said, "Brandon's show was incredible, by the way. The crowd was so into it, he really has something." I said, "That's great." She said, "Are you okay? You sound tired." I said, "I'm okay. It was a long day." She said, "Get some sleep. We'll celebrate soon, all together." I said, "Yeah. Good night, Mom." I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor for a while, which is something I do sometimes when I need to feel the solidness of things. The envelope was on the counter above me. I had left it open now, the letter half unfolded, the Edinburgh letterhead visible even from where I sat. I thought about my parents' faces when they arrived at 1:45, how genuinely happy they looked to be there. I thought about 3:05, and the text with its 3 exclamation points. I thought about what my mother had said on the phone that week. "You've always been the strong one." I thought about Aunt Helen, driving 40 minutes with a bad hip, arriving at 1:30 with a thermos and a book, staying until the last photograph, ordering tiramisu, and making my committee laugh. I thought about what it means to show up. Not the intention to show up, not the warmth you feel towards someone when you think about showing up someday, but the actual physical act of being in a hallway when someone walks out of a room and needs a face to find. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning, I called the Edinburgh Institute and told them I would accept the position. The start date we agreed on was 8 weeks out. I booked a one-way ticket that afternoon. I want to be specific about why it was one way. It wasn't a statement, or not only a statement. It was a practical acknowledgement that I did not know yet how long I would stay, and that the life I was building was no longer oriented around the possibility of coming back. That is different from leaving in anger. It is leaving with clarity. There is a version of this story where I am running away, and that is not the version I lived. I told my advisor first. She cried a little and said the Edinburgh lab was lucky to have me, and that she expected a collaboration within 2 years. I told my lab mates, who threw a small party in the break room with store-bought cake and a balloon that said, "Congratulations, graduate," because it was the only congratulations balloon the campus store had. I told Aunt Helen on our Sunday call. She said, "Good. Just that. Just good. And then, I was wondering when you would." I said, "Did you know?" She said, "I knew the letter was from Edinburgh. I know what that institute means in your field, and I know you, Claire. So yes, I knew." I said, "I'm going to miss you." She said, "I should hope so. I'll visit. My hip has been on planes before." I told my parents on a Thursday evening, on a call with both of them, because I wanted to say it once and clearly, and not have it filtered through one of them to the other. My mother said, "Edinburgh? Scotland?" I said, "Yes." My father said, "When?" I said, 6 weeks. There was a silence that was different from the silences I was used to in conversations with them, more textured, somehow. My mother said, "We didn't know you were thinking about this." I said, "I've been thinking about it for a while." My father said, "Claire, this is a big decision. Have you really thought through all the—" I said, "I've thought through all of it." My mother said, "But so soon. What about—" She stopped. I don't know what she was going to say. What about the celebration dinner we haven't planned? What about the family we imagined you staying close to? What about the version of your future we had pictured without quite realizing we'd pictured it? I said, "I have a world-class research opportunity, and I'm taking it." My father said, "We could come visit you, to see you off, at the airport." I said, "That's okay, you don't have to." My mother said, "Claire, we want to." I said, "I know, but it's a long drive and it's a weekday and I know you're both busy." There was another silence. I said, "I have to go finish some things. I'll call you before I leave." I did call them before I left. I called them the night before my flight, and the conversation was warm and a little careful, and my mother cried and my father told me to take care of myself, and they were real things. The tears and the words, I don't doubt that. My family is not a family of villains. They are a family of people who looked up one day and found they had arranged their love into a shape that left one person perpetually outside the frame, and by the time they noticed, they were not sure how to rearrange it, or whether I would wait for them to try. That is harder to be angry at than cruelty would be. I want you to know I understand that. My flight left on a Tuesday at 11 in the morning. I took a car to the airport. I checked one large suitcase and carried on my laptop and the framed photograph my lab mates had given me. A picture of all of us at the department holiday party the previous December, everyone laughing at something off camera. I sat in the terminal with coffee and the strange drifting feeling that comes before a large change, when everything that has been solid becomes briefly liquid before it sets again into a new shape. Aunt Helen had sent me a package the week before I left. Inside was a small framed quote, handwritten in her careful schoolteacher printing. Because she said the printed ones always look generic, it said, "The most loving thing you can do for people who underestimated you is to become exactly who you always were." I brought that with me too. Edinburgh received me in the way that cities sometimes do, when you have arrived exactly where you were supposed to be, with gray skies and cold air and a kind of austere beauty that asks nothing of you except that you pay attention. My flat was small and looked out over a narrow street where there was a bakery that opened at 6 in the morning, and I spent the first week learning the rhythms of the place, the way you learn a new language, slowly, and then all at once. The work was extraordinary. The lab was everything the reputation had promised. My colleagues were serious and generous in the way of people who are genuinely in love with what they do, and within 3 months I was more productive than I had been in the last year of my PhD. Because the thing about finally being somewhere that fits is that you stop spending energy on the distance between where you are and where you're supposed to be. I called my parents every couple of weeks. The calls were kind and moderately awkward, and we were all, I think, learning a new geography. My mother asked real questions about the research, which surprised me, and I wondered if she had been reading up on things, or if she had simply started listening differently. My father asked about the city and whether it was cold and whether I was eating enough, which are not deep questions, but are not nothing either. Brandon texted me occasionally. Sporadic updates. A voice memo once where he played something new he'd written that was actually quite good. 3 months after I arrived, I gave my first major talk at a symposium in London. My advisor flew in from the States. The room held 200 researchers. I stood at the podium and presented work I was proud of, and when it was over, the department chair from Cambridge introduced himself and asked if I'd be interested in discussing a collaboration. I stood in the reception afterward with a glass of sparkling water and thought about a parking lot, and a hallway, and a thermos of bad coffee, and the exact sound Aunt Helen made when a door opened and a title changed. I had sent her a recording of the talk. She sent back a voice message of 12 seconds, which was just her saying, "That's my girl," in the exact tone she's used for the better part of my life, followed by the sound of her setting down the phone. I played it 4 times. There is something I have been asked about, when people who know the full story ask me about it, and that is whether I regret the way I left. Not leaving, but the way. Whether I should have said more, confronted more, demanded the acknowledgement I had spent 28 years not quite receiving. I think about this seriously when people ask it, because it deserves a serious answer. I think that some things cannot be resolved through confrontation, not because the feelings aren't real, but because the people involved are not yet capable of receiving them. My parents loved me. They loved me with a portion of their attention and their hearts that they had always kept slightly smaller than the portion they gave my brother, for reasons I could trace if I wanted to his fragility, his need, their fear of what would happen if he failed, but tracing the reasons doesn't change the shape of the wound. You can understand a thing and still need to leave the room where it lives. What I know is this: I did not raise my voice. I did not deliver a speech. I did not make them feel small. I simply made a decision about where my life would go, and I went there. And I became in Edinburgh the exact person I had always been in that house, capable, determined, precise, except that here, no one treated those qualities as reasons I needed less. My mother flew to Edinburgh 8 months after I arrived. She came alone, which surprised me. And she stayed for 5 days. Which was brave of her because she has never traveled internationally without my father. On the third evening, we were sitting in a small restaurant near the castle, and she said, "I have been thinking about your defense." I said, "Okay." She said, "I think we handled that wrong." I looked at her across the table. She was not making eye contact. She was looking at her glass. She said, "I don't think we have always handled things right. With you and Brandon, I don't think we saw it. And I'm not sure that's an excuse. But I wanted you to know I've been seeing it more clearly." I said, "I know." She looked up. I said, "I know you're seeing it. I can hear it in the calls." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm really okay, Mom. I'm actually really okay." She nodded. She looked out the window at the street, the cobblestones, the lights. She said, "Aunt Helen told me you played her voicemail 4 times. I laughed, actually laughed, and my mother smiled. And it wasn't fixed. None of it was fixed. But it was the beginning of a different kind of honest, and that is something. That is not nothing. I am still in Edinburgh. My fellowship was extended. I have a second paper coming out next month. And the Cambridge collaboration produced results that my advisor says could make a real difference in how certain drug trials are conducted, which is what I came here to do, what I have always been trying to do. Aunt Helen visited in the fall, her hip and all, and we walked slowly along the Royal Mile, and she told me stories about things that happened before I was born, and I told her about the work, and she asked real questions and waited for real answers. At the end of the trip, she stood at the departure gate and held my face one more time, the way she always has, and she said, "You know what I've always known about you?" I said, "What?" She said, "You were never the strong one in the way they meant it. You were strong the way water is strong, not because it's hard, but because it always finds where it needs to go." I thought about that on the train back from the airport. I thought about a kitchen counter and an envelope and 11 days of not quite being ready. I thought about what it means to finally open the things you've been afraid to open. I think sometimes the most important moment is not the one when you board the plane or take the stage or hear your new title spoken aloud for the first time. I think the most important moment is quieter than that. It is the moment when you stop organizing your life around whether the people who should have shown up are going to show up, and you start showing up for yourself instead. That moment happened for me on a Saturday afternoon in April, in a university hallway, when I looked up from my phone and found that the hallway was not empty, because Aunt Helen was there, and she had always been there. And I was finally paying full attention,